The video you are about to watch is from an old woodworking magazine that I published during the years of 2003 to approximately 2006. This was a very unique magazine. It was purely video content and it was distributed on DVDs. The magazine ran for approximately 3.5 years, and then due to financial concerns, we simply had to terminate the magazine. We moved on to other things over the last roughly 15 years. However, there has been a request to resurrect this content, so I've gone through the trouble to get the equipment, the products, everything I needed in order to bring this content back to life to share with everyone. Here on this YouTube channel, we'll be putting up approximately 100 to 120 of the original stories that appeared in that magazine. The magazine was called Woodworking at Home Magazine, and it was truly one of a kind in the world. I really hope you enjoy these videos, and please tell your friends about them.
Cabinet scrapers are one of those tools that once you learn how to use one and sharpen one, you're probably going to find that it's a very, very handy tool to have in the shop. Now, a cabinet scraper is generally used to put a nice smooth surface on your work. Now, of course, we're most familiar with sanding. Now, depending on the surface texture that you're starting with and how rough it is, you may have to start with 80 grit sandpaper. Then you would move up to, say, 120, 150, and then 220 grit sandpaper, and maybe a little bit finer depending on the species of wood. So sanding actually has a number of steps to go from beginning to end, and it can be quite a bit of work. Even with many of the powerful sanders that we have available to us, especially now with the random orbit sanders, you still have to go over that surface 3 or 4 times, working your way through the various grits. Cabinet scraper is a one-shot deal. At that point, this board is silky smooth, so I don't have to go through a series of steps to get to that final surface finish that I want. Now, sharpening a scraper is kind of a misnomer. You're kind of not sharpening it. What you're doing is pushing a burr. You're moving the metal over the edge of it, creating a burr on it. But I'd like to show you a couple of real close-up details on a scraper before we get into the actual process of sharpening it and then using one. Now, as I show you the scraper here, we'll look at the edges and notice how we've got it almost polished, nice and smooth. And that's very important. You don't want a rough edge there. Now we have to form a burr on the edges of the scraper. Now, even with the magnifying glass, this burr is so small, it's hard to see. But you start to get an idea of how that burr looks on there. As I drag my thumb across here, you can kind of see this edge a little bit. Now, how big of a burr that you want is somewhat critical, but it can vary quite a bit. Now, to help show you the size of burr that I work with on my scrapers, I've got a dial indicator that will show us or allow us to measure the actual size of this burr. Now, this dial indicator is graduated in 1/2 of a thousandths. So as I put this down on my workbench right above the scraper, notice the indicator reading 0. Now, as I slide the scraper across, you'll see that the indicator moves up, and it goes up about 3/1000ths of an inch right at that burr. So that tells me that that burr is 3/1000ths of an inch. Now, you don't need to have a magnifying glass and a dial indicator to sharpen your scraper, but it helps to convey a couple of pieces of information. One, you do want a nice smooth edge. It's got to be smooth. If it's jaggedy at all, then you're going to get that sawtooth scraping action, and it's not going to look very appealing. The size of the burr, being about 3/1000ths of an inch, works out pretty good for me in the way I like to scrape. Some people like a little smaller burr, others like a little bigger burr. You'll have to find that sweet spot for you. But as a starting point, for how to measure that burr, it's kind of, without a dial indicator, you can't just measure it physically. But there is a comparative we can draw that will help greatly. Pluck a hair from your head, if you still got some hair that is. Lay that down on a flat surface and then hold it at the ends with your fingers, and then run your finger over that hair. Your hair is about 2.5 thousandths in diameter. So that'll give you a feel on your fingertip as to how big the burr should be. If the burr on your scraper feels about the size of a human hair, then you're in the right area. Then it's just a matter of working that burr either a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller depending on how you work with the scraper. Now let's take a look at some of the steps necessary to get a nice burr on your scraper. Now there's 3 steps to sharpening a scraper. Step 1, we need to get the edge of the scraper smooth, flat, and square to the sides. Now it doesn't have to be perfectly square or anything like that, but we do want it smooth and we want it square to the sides. And we don't want any burr on our first step. Now chances are the scraper already has a burr on it, so we need to remove that. And there's a couple of tools that we're going to use in that process. Now the first step that we're going to do is to remove that burr. We're going to be using an ordinary mill bastard file, single cut, very fine file. Now I'll clamp my scraper in the bench vise and then we'll just carefully file the existing burr away. Now because the burr will exist on these edges, the first step I want to do with my file is to run it flat against the side and push it along in a nice even stroke, keeping the file flat against the side of the scraper. Now you can run your finger up in this direction and you'll feel if the burr is still there or if it's gone. Got that side good? Now I'll do this side. Now at this point you'll probably have a slight burr up near the top edge. Now at this point I'm just going to hold the file pointed in the direction that I want to move. Very lightly, it doesn't take a lot of pressure. Now at this point all my burrs are gone. Now the surface might be a little bit rough yet. Now if you hold your file 90 degrees to the scraper and draw it towards you, this is called draw filing. And it will give you a very, very smooth finish. And at this point we could actually go on to the burnishing process. But I've found that if I just go a little step further and hone that edge nice and smooth, I get a better burr that's more consistent across the length of the scraper. So now let's take a look at how we hone that. Now you could use any type of honing stone such as a water stone, oil stone, or a ceramic. I happen to have a diamond plate here. Now I want a little lubricant on there, so I'm going to put some water, not Mountain Dew, that's too sticky. We want water. Then we'll take and hold the scraper flat against our diamond plate, and we'll hold it straight up and down, like so, and we'll just move it back and forth a little bit. Being a diamond, this will cut very, very fast and put a nice smooth edge on there. Then it won't hurt to take and lay the scraper on its side, a few wipes on each face, and we're ready for burnishing. And now we're ready for step number 2, where we want to create one burr on one of the edges. To create those burrs, we got to use a burnishing tool. Now you may just assume that this is like a screwdriver, but it's actually a very, very hardened steel rod. It's very, very smooth and very hard. This one happens to be soft out near the end, but very hard in this area. There's also a burnishing tool that's made specifically for sharpening scrapers. Now there's a couple different styles of this. It has a dial on it. You loosen up the locking lever, and then you can set your hook angle or your burr angle using a little dial. And I usually have mine set up at about 7 or 8 degrees on the dial. Now the only 2 styles that I've seen of this is the wooden block type, and then there's a more, what I assume to be a more modern version that is a plastic molded piece that holds the burnisher. Now inside here is our burnishing rod, and when we rotate this dial, we end up changing the angle of that burnishing rod. Now our scraper is going to fit through this little slot right here. We'll place this over the top of the scraper and draw it across. Now before you start burnishing, you'll want to place some oil on that edge. And it can be any type of oil. Heck, you could even use motor oil. I just happen to have some honing oil handy, so that's what I'm using. Get a little bit on my burnisher as well. Now as mentioned, I like about a 7-degree angle. So what I have to do is hold my burnisher at a 7-degree angle as I draw it over the edge of our scraper. So I'm just going to lay this on here, and I'm pushing down very firmly, and I'm going to drag that along. And what that's starting to do, it's starting to push the material from this top surface over to the edge, and it's going to create that burr that we want. Now you do have to put a pretty substantial amount of force down against the edge of that scraper. Just starting to come up now. And that's just about right. Now as mentioned, I've got mine set at about a 7-degree angle, and when I push down on this and slide it across, you'll feel where that rod is in there, the burnishing rod. So that'll give you an idea where you want to start. Now I'm going to push down firmly and draw this towards me. Three swipes and I've got a pretty decent burr starting there. Now I've got my burr that's just about the size of a human hair. Now at this point, only one edge has the burr on it. This side does not yet. Now we need to spin it around and do the other edge for step 3. And now we're ready to use it. And that would have completed step number 3 because we've got our burr on both faces. Now at this point, the scraper is pretty much ready to use. You'll have to take a test cut and see how it feels for you. Now when using a scraper of this type, I like to do a push cut. So I'm going to take my 2 thumbs like so, and I'm going to push against it, and I'm going to curve it. Notice the curvature that I'm getting there. It doesn't take much, but all my push force is done with my 2 thumbs. So now I'm going to lay it down and notice my angle against the board, about like so. That angle can be adjusted to accommodate the burr that you've thrown up and how much force you can push into the scraping motion. Now you can also pull with the scraper, but you want to push it and curve it in this direction. So now, and depending on the strength of your fingers and your hands, you may get better results pushing or by pulling. Now you'll notice here that I'm actually going cross grain or diagonal to the grain. You can get away with some angularity with the direction that you're either pushing or pulling. Now what you really want are these fine little shavings. You don't want dust coming up from your scraping action. And I found that if I skew my scraper slightly to the face of the board, that I can oftentimes get a better cut. So now let's show you that. Now with just those few pushes, the temperature of this scraper is almost to the point where it feels like it's burning my fingers. That's one of the drawbacks of using a scraper. It does require a substantial amount of push power. It generates a substantial amount of heat, and that heat, of course, is immediately transferred through the metal into your hands. Now, as mentioned, when you're doing your scraping, you want shavings. You don't want dust. Now what I'll do is I'll dull down my scraper, taking the burrs off, and then I'll show you how a dull scraper would look when you're using it. Now, as you can see, we've just gotten some sawdust with our dull scraper. Now, we've seen what happens when we have a proper burr with a good hook on it versus no burr and no hook. Now, if your board just came off of your surface planer, and depending on the type of planer that you have, you may see your mill marks on the surface of the board. Of course, they would be running perpendicular to the way it was fed through the planer. Now, if you just take your scraper and hold it square to the board like so and do your scraping action, the scraper is probably going to try to follow the undulations in the board, or that rough texture. But by angling it slightly again, it will ride over and just shave off the high spots of those ripple marks or mill marks. Now, if you're worried about the temperature of the scraper burning your fingers, there are holders available that will hold the scraper in that curved shape, and it has handles on it so that you can scrape more continuously. However, I found that the scraper cools right down in just a matter of seconds, so it's generally not a real big deal. That gives you a rough idea of how to go about sharpening your scraper and getting it to function properly for you. Now, it does take some tweaking. As I mentioned, that 7-degree angle works for me. For someone else, they may like a smaller angle or perhaps a more aggressive angle. It does take time to experiment a little bit. Now, scrapers have been around for many, many years, and they're just a very, very proven technique for putting a nice smooth surface on a piece of work. Now, what are some of the other advantages of why you'd want to use a scraper? Well, I bought this one, I'm guessing about 10 or 15 years ago. I don't exactly remember when. And it's been sharpened and resharpened and resharpened and resharpened numerous times, and it's still working great for me. So I don't have to continually buy sandpaper. I can buy the scraper once and use it for many, many years. So there's the economics of using a scraper. There's the efficiency. A few quick swipes with a scraper will put a silky smooth surface on a piece of work. So you don't have to go through all the progressions of different sandpaper. So there's the efficiency of work involved. The sharpening of it's pretty easy, the use is pretty easy, but there is some technique. It also requires some manpower. You do have to really push these things through the wood. It's not something that you just lay on there and magically drag it across and expect it to work. You've got to push it through the wood and shave that top thin layer of wood away from your work surface. Now, getting into trouble with a scraper, that's the one downside to it. As you're scraping along an edge like this, it's very easy to start fracturing the fibers of the wood that are on the outside edge. There you kind of heard how loud that was. Now at that point, I'm actually tearing that outer edge. So you have to be careful when working near the edges of your work, where two different grain directions come together, such as that on a face frame. You have to be kind of cautious there, where you're scraping almost perpendicular or at a 45-degree angle to the two different grain directions. You'll have your rail and your stile. You'll have to kind of work at an angle to those two joints to get a nice smooth surface. Now, apart from the economics, being that you only have to buy the scraper once, the efficiency that you only need to really work the surface once, beyond that, there is another good advantage to using a scraper over a power sander. It's the amount of sawdust that you create in your woodworking shop. You're going to get very little sawdust if you've got the burr on there just right and you're using it properly. You get very little sawdust and you end up with pretty big shavings that are very easy to clean up. Plus, it's pretty hard to breeze some of these big shavings in. So scrapers have their place. They're very easy to use once you understand the technique and once you get the feel of how big that burr needs to be on there and how to put it on the scraper. So I'd say pick up a couple of these, pick up a burnishing tool of some sort, either the new high-tech style or the old-fashioned burnishing rod, and start giving it a try. You may find that the surface on your work is greatly improved. I'm Chris DeHut for Woodworking at Home magazine. Thanks for watching.
I sincerely hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you truly enjoyed it, please help us share this information with the rest of the communities. Please hit the subscribe button, give us a big thumbs up, and be sure to tell your friends about this channel. Thanks again for watching.